This is Carolina Ghost Towns, a podcast about the vanished towns and lost communities in South Carolina, North Carolina, and maybe a few other places. I'm your host, Tom Taylor. Today I've got a special guest to help tell the story of this week's town. Back before COVID hit, I was privileged to teach a class with Scott Withrow at Furman University's OLLI program on the lost communities of South Carolina. Scott, would you like to introduce yourself?
Okay, well, I'm from North Carolina. I've been in the upstate since 89. Actually, I was here before then. I taught high school in Anderson County and went back to North Carolina and came again. So I do enjoy history and traveling to places I write about and just trying to get to those places all I can.
Thanks, Scott. We'll hear more from Scott in a bit, but first a question needs to be addressed. When is a ghost town not a ghost town? If an old place comes back as a new, modern community at the same location, does that erase the old town? How about if a new town with a different name pops up in that same location? There are examples of the latter, such as Hamburg dying out and North Augusta taking its place. That's the dilemma I face when deciding to add a place name to my list of ghost towns. I'm starting to lean toward the term lost communities rather than ghost town. The term ghost town implies that the area is completely abandoned, more like what you would see out west. In our area, a community may be lost, but something new springs up in its place. I got some help with this murky definition from a fellow ghost town explorer. Dan Klein has a podcast similar to mine, entitled Midwest Ghost Towns. In his first episode, he references a scale developed by Dave Baker. Baker's classification was based on one developed by the U.S. government, but his has more detail. Baker called his scale the Leegstadt scale, derived from the Dutch words meaning empty and city. The Leegstadt scale has several different classifications for ghost towns, based on what remains of the town. These types are as follows. Type A, a completely barren site with no remnants remaining to suggest a town, community, or village of any type ever existed there. Type B, a site of rubble and roofless buildings remaining with no obvious population, or a location marked with only a sign noting that something once existed. Type C, a cemetery, may or may not have a sign and may or may not share the same name of the community. A church, creamery, bridge, mill, fort, or other civic indicator remains to mark where a town or village existed. These can be representative of a township so long as it is no further than 1 mile from the site. Type D, a semi-abandoned community. The site may have few residences, but all commercial and industrial buildings are abandoned. Type E, a historic community. The site may have some residences and fewer than 10 commercial and industrial buildings that are in use. Type F, a restored, fabricated, or semi-dilapidated community maintained as an attraction or within a park. Type G, integrated community. The site was either annexed into a neighboring community or is presently a location where new homes or buildings occupy the site of a former town. In addition to these types, Baker further defines a ghost town as to whether or not it was ever incorporated as an actual town. Group 1, a formerly platted and incorporated city or town. Group 2, a formerly platted, unincorporated city or town. Group 3, a formerly non-platted community of industrial or commercial significance, usually related to coal mining or quarries, but there are several towns in the Carolinas centered around other industries, such as textiles and logging. Group 4, an informal community, non-platted around a central location or locations. Examples of these include a school, church, or railroad station. Group 5, an informal community created on or centered around private land. It may or may not have been subdivided into lots. Group 6, a pioneer village having been established within 10 years of statehood, with no formal recognition otherwise. This classification system makes it much easier to define and identify lost communities. I'll post Baker's Leegstadt scale in the show notes. Looking back at some of my previous episodes, we might define those towns in this way. For example, Lone Star would be classified as a D1, a semi-abandoned community with a few residences, but pretty much all of the commercial buildings are abandoned, and 1 being that it was incorporated as a town. Andersonville, on the other hand, would be A1. There's no remnants remaining to suggest a town, but it was incorporated. This week's town is the town of Willington in McCormick County, South Carolina. Using the Leegstadt scale, I would class it as either a D1 or an E1, a historic community. Willington has a long history, but it has also long ceased to be a viable town. Even so, there is a dedicated group of residents determined to bring new life into the community, or at least make sure that the town is not forgotten. Willington is a small town in the Savannah River Valley, not far from the town of Vienna mentioned in our last episode. The area was settled by a mix that included French Huguenots, Scots-Irish, and German Palatines. As for the town itself, I couldn't find a date for its initial settlement. The town appears on Mill's 1825 map along with nearby Petersburg, Lisbon, and Vienna. Scott Withrow taught the segment of our course that dealt with Willington. He led a field trip to the town during the Lost Communities course, and he and I have explored the cemeteries and areas surrounding the town. I asked Scott to lend his expertise on the area to this podcast. I really did enjoy the class that you and I taught together on the Lost Communities. That was a lot of fun. And today, I particularly wanted to ask you about Willington, South Carolina.
Okay, Willington is a small place on the map in McCormick County. It's about 13 miles west of the county seat of McCormick. It was a cotton boom town and a railroad town, busy and prosperous because of the cotton. By 1916, it had 13 stores, a livery stable, a doctor's office, post office, and at one point it had a bank. But the town later faced extinction. Twice it was listed on the Endangered Historic Places list, 1995 and 97, by the National Trust for Historic Preservation.
Okay, Scott, why don't you tell me a little bit about the Willington Academy and Moses Waddle, I believe is the way you said it was supposed to be pronounced.
Right. Moses Waddle, his family always said it's pronounced the same as what a duck does. So Waddle is correct. He established the Willington Academy in 1804, and it was a strict college preparatory school offering a classical curriculum. Students were required to memorize, not only memorize, but translate and recite 250 lines or more of classic Greek or Latin every night. This was every night. Because of this and his strict teaching, his classical teaching, he was known as the foremost educator in the South.
Okay.
And certainly he was the one who came up, some people think, with the name Willington. There's a little bit of a mystery where the name came from. Some people say he was willing to come, willing to serve. They were willing to bring him. But what I hear most, that he saw that the French Huguenots, who were Calvinists, were willing to worship alongside the Scots-Irish Presbyterians, who were also Calvinists. So the willingness of the two cultures to come together there, the Huguenot and Scots-Irish.
So that's the origin of the name Willington for the community.
People are always quoting this, authors are, about his graduates by profession. He had vice presidents, two of them, ministers to Spain. I won't go over the whole list, but there were judges, college presidents. He started his academy, I think I mentioned, in 1804. But in 1819, he left and went to Georgia and became president of a small college there called Franklin College. That little college was in Athens, Georgia. And now, of course, we know it as the University of Georgia.
Well, that is an impressive resume. The South Carolina Picture Project website has this to say about the academy and the town. And I'm quoting from the website. While Willington Academy brought esteem and prominence to the community, it did not bring commerce. The town struggled economically until a railroad was established here in 1886. Attempts at growing cash crops, such as tobacco and grapes for wine, proved futile. It was not until cotton flourished and the railroad was constructed that Willington began to prosper. The depot attracted new residents to the area, as did the town's policy of not charging taxes. However, the town's prosperity began to fade with the coming of the boll weevil in the 1920s, which destroyed much of the lucrative cotton crop. The town also suffered during the Great Depression, which significantly lowered the price of cotton. The local bank failed, and people vacated the community in search of financial security. The town's charter was not renewed in 1933. So you'd say the decline of the town started prior to the 1929 crash, or shortly thereafter?
More shortly thereafter, the Depression, some of the boll weevil, and then the coming of the automobile too, the railroad, the Savannah Valley Railroad, which was a really short railroad from McCormick to Anderson, but it had a lot to do with the cotton culture. And when that declined, the railroad declined, and also the coming of the automobile led the railroad to decline. It's a wonderful rails to trail there in McCormick County today where the railroad was.
Right. Okay. Well, I was just looking at a 1933 unpublished Sanborn map, and one of the things that struck me was that most of the major brick buildings along the main street were listed as vacant as early as 1933. So that must have been some rapid decline in the town.
Rapid decline, and by the 50s it was certainly vacant, and a lot of the resurgence has come about because of one person and others. Sarah Covan Youngst is an educator, author. She's been a missionary and minister. Her Covan ancestors were Huguenot from that area. In fact, her grandfather had a store in downtown Willington. She saw it and what had happened, and she lived away, said something should be done about that. And today, thanks to Sarah, it's a book town. And I might add a history town too, but it's a book town. She has a bookstore there. Sarah established Willington on the Way, which is a nonprofit operating the bookstore, and the History Center, which is a wonderful museum and a wonderful place for people researching the area. I have sections in the bookstore on Southern writers, local history, cooking and cookbooks. They have a section on theology, and have other history. So Willington on the Way, I found online, is hopes to renovate all the brick buildings. The bookstore is in part of them. A number of store buildings make up the bookstore, and then there's the History Center also, which has been expanded some too recently. So thanks to Sarah Youngst.
So that's a very good example of a town that was almost a ghost town, but has started to come back, and that's always a good thing. Okay, are there any other bits of history or bits of information you'd like to add about the town?
This man was Alfred Moss. He had a meat market in Wilmington. The old building still stands. It's tumbling in, and I've taken a picture of the doorway. But when I took the picture, I didn't know anything about the history, and thanks to Sarah and one of Alfred Moss' descendants, I know more. The old building stands between the highway and the former railroad. It was opened in 1919, and it was the only business in Willington operated by an African American. Alfred Moss owned 150 head of cattle, which he kept on a 200-acre farm along the Savannah River. And in the fall, I found out he would have a cattle drive led by men on horses, 2 horses and a mule, and I always imagined cattle dogs along too during that period. They'd bring the cattle into Willington. I can imagine, the dogs along with him. He butchered the cattle on Fridays, and he sold the meat on Saturdays, and people from miles around came to buy this grass-fed meat. His son delivered meat from house to house. That's what I learned about this old building I was photographing. That was the Alfred Moss Meat Market, and his family is still in the area.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Of course, the area around there, just to the south, is Lake Thurman, once called Clark's Hill on the Savannah River. And I always think about the namesake, the Savannah River. And when I drive out to the Old Noble Cemetery on the hillside, I see huge pine trees and I see grass, and I think about that Savannah landscape that may have been there. And I think about sometimes what Alfred Moss grazing lands look like now under Lake Thurman. So you have a town like Willington that's coming back, but you have a lost culture that's a mystery nonetheless. It's underneath Lake Thurman.
Through the efforts of Sarah Youngst and others in the Willington on the Way organization, there's still quite a bit to see and do in the old town. The Willington Bookshop and History Center occupies a prominent place in one of the old storefronts. In addition to books on history and theology, there are historical artifacts and dioramas of Waddell's Willington Academy and of the old town. There are also genealogy and historical documents for researchers. My favorite exhibit in the History Center is the display of instruments from the Cowan family string band. Charles Wesley Cowan and his family lived in Willington in the 1800s and traveled around the area giving concerts. I've been known to drool over the case displaying Charles Cowan's magnificent fiddle and Josh Cooley's banjo. Also featured as a part of the History Center are the Springfield Olive African American School and the Old Town Post Office. The Savannah Valley Railroad Trail runs through the town along the course of the old railroad. Willington Presbyterian Church is still a vital part of the community. Not far from the main commercial center of town is the location of the old Willington Academy. There's a stone monument, and across from that, the old Willington Cemetery. Overlooking Lake Thurmond is another historic cemetery, the Noble Cemetery, also the site of the Noble Plantation. South of Willington, on the banks of Lake Thurmond, is a stone cross marking the location of New Bordeaux, site of the first settlement of Huguenots in the area. There used to be a very good Thai restaurant in town, but sadly that has now closed. When I was trying to decide whether or not to include Willington on my list of ghost towns, my wife replied that any town with a Thai restaurant isn't really a ghost town. Even with the Thai restaurant no longer open, through the efforts of some dedicated residents, Willington is no longer a ghost town, but a vital community with a long history. That wraps it up for this episode. My thanks to Scott Withrow for helping out with this ghost town. I hope to bring Scott back on to tell us about some of the other lost communities that we covered in the course that we taught. I will include links to the photographs and resources that I used for this podcast in the show notes. As usual, subscribe, rate, comment, and recommend us to your friends. Thanks for listening.
In this southern ghost town, we found a story untold. In the shadows of the past, we unravel, secrets unfold. With each step we take, we journey back in time. In this southern ghost town, we leave our footprints behind.
Thanks for listening. The opening music was composed by Lex FM with additional music from Pixabay. The song Southern Ghost Town was generated by Suno AI. All other music was composed and recorded by me, Tom Taylor. Carolina Ghost Towns is a part of the Random Connections empire. It's pretty much a one-man show, so I wear all the hats, including producer, writer, researcher, sound engineer, publicist, and bartender. If you like the show, please subscribe on your favorite pod venue and be sure to give us feedback. If you have questions, comments, or ideas for the show, you can reach me at carolinaghosttownspod@gmail.com. For more information and show notes, visit randomconnections.com. Thank you.
In this southern ghost town, we found a story untold. In the shadows of the past, we unravel, secrets unfold. With each step we take, we journey back in time. In this southern ghost town, we leave our footprints behind.
Random Connections.